talking to a new black lady. Mrs. Smith saw them and got very, very angry. Why aren't you wearing your shirt? Mrs. Smith yelled at Esosa. I forgot, Esosa said. Feeling nervous, Mrs. Smith marched over to the lady and started yelling at her. Stay away from my man, she shouted. The lady was confused and trying to explain, but Mrs. Smith wouldn't listen. She kept shouting until Esosa stepped in. Please, Mrs. Smith. Once upon a time, in a small African village, there lived a young man named Esosa. Esosa's family struggled to make ends meet, and he dreamed of a better life. In Esosa's village, life was very tough. His family lived in a small mud hut with a thatched roof. They didn't have much money, so they grew their own food and fetched water from the nearby river. Esosa's parents worked hard every day, but it was still a struggle to put enough food on the table. When Esosa's friend Musa returned from abroad, he brought back stories of big houses, fancy cars, and lots of money. Esosa listened wide-eyed as Musa talked about how he met a rich white woman who took care of him. Hey, Esosa, Musa said, you know all white people are rich. You should find one to marry. You will never have to worry about money again. Esosa's eyes sparkled with hope. Really? You think so? Yeah, man. It's easy. Just find a white woman, marry her, and boom, you are rich. Esosa couldn't stop thinking about Musa's word. He dreamed of a life without struggle, where he could buy anything he wanted and never go hungry again. And so, he set off on a journey to find his own wealthy white woman, believing it was the key to his dream coming true. Esosa's parents, Mama Ama and Baba Esosa, often spoke of the outside world with a mixture of awe and envy. Sitting under the shade of the mango tree, they would tell Esosa tales of far-off land where the sun never stopped shining and the people lived in grand houses filled with treasures. Esosa, Mama Ama would always say, you see those cars passing by on the dusty road? Those belong to the white people. They have so much money, they don't know what to do with it. Baba Esosa will nod in agreement. Yes, my son, white people live in big houses with shiny roofs and eat the finest food. They are the richest people in the world. Esosa listened intently to his parents' words. Their story weaving dreams of wealth and abundance in his young mind. He looked around his humble village where money was scarce and opportunities few, and he believed what his parents told him without question. To Esosa, all white people were indeed rich, and marrying one seemed like the answer to all his family's struggles. After hearing Musa's advice, Esosa decided to find a white woman to marry. He went to the nearby town and found a place called Cyber Cafe where people could use computers. Esosa paid some money and joined a website where people could meet and talk to each other. On the website, Esosa met an old white woman whose name was Mrs. Smith. She was 80 years old but seemed kind in her messages. Esosa felt excited because he thought marrying Mrs. Smith would make him rich. As they talked more, Mrs. Smith asked Esosa to come to visit her in her country. She said she would help him with the paperwork so he could get a visa to travel there. Esosa was overjoyed and eagerly agreed. Mrs. Smith processed the papers, and soon Esosa had a visa in his hand. He couldn't wait to go to the foreign country, called Fairview and start his new life. When Esosa arrived in Fairview, he felt very mixed feeling. The town was not like he had imagined. Instead of big houses and lots of money, he saw broken buildings and people who looked hungry. I thought Fairview would be rich, Esosa said to Mrs. Smith, feeling disappointed. Mrs. Smith sighed. I am sorry, Esosa. Life here is not that easy. We have to work hard to get by. Esosa was surprised, yet he persevered. He had expected Mrs. Smith to be rich and give him everything he wanted. Instead, she lived in a small house and asked him to work in her garden and on her farm. Aside the poverty side, Mrs. Smith was also very insecure wife. Mrs. Smith worried a lot about Esosa's talking to other younger women. So she put labels on all his shirts saying, "Property of Mrs. Smith." Esosa had to wear one whenever he went out. One day, Esosa forgot to wear his shirt while talking to a new black lady. Mrs. Smith saw them and got very, very angry. "Why aren't you wearing your shirts?" Mrs. Smith yelled at Esosa. "I forgot," Esosa said. Feeling nervous, Mrs. Smith marched over to the lady and started yelling at her. "Stay away from my man," she shouted. The lady was confused and trying to explain, but Mrs. Smith wouldn't listen. She kept shouting until Esosa stepped in. "Please, Mrs. Smith, she's just a friend," Esosa pleaded, trying to calm her down. After that incident, Esosa realized how silly the situation had become. He started to think about his relationship with Mrs. Smith and whether it was really what he wanted. Esosa felt he had traveled all the way for nothing. Instead of a life of luxury, he found himself working hard for very little money and living with a woman who is making his life hell. As days passed, Esosa faced many difficulties in Fairview. Language barrier. Esosa struggled to understand the people in Fairview because they spoke a different language than him. Lack of money. Even though Esosa worked hard, he didn't earn much money. It was difficult to buy food and other things he needed. Homesick. Esosa missed his family and his village in Africa. He longed to return home where life was simpler and people cared for each other. Esosa learned something very important in Fairview. Just because someone is white doesn't mean they are rich. And just because someone is black doesn't mean they are poor. It is not about the color of your skin. It's about how hard you work. In the end, Esosa realized that marrying a rich white woman wouldn't make him wealthy. He understood that true wealth comes from working hard and being honest. So he decided to go back to his village in Africa, back home. Esosa felt grateful for the simple things in life. He appreciated his family, his friends, and the support of his community. Even though the journey was tough, Esosa found happiness and fulfillment in building a better life for himself through his own efforts. Thank you so much for watching. If you like our video, please subscribe to the channel and don't forget to share this story with your family and your friends. Till we see you again in our next story. Goodbye.